Hi, everyone. Welcome to the GoldFish Report. I'm your host and researcher, Louisa. This is Friday, June 12th, 2020. This is GoldFish Report number 500. This is a multi-part series focusing on the greatest threat to mankind. We're going to be discussing artificial intelligence with someone you all know very well, Professor McKnight Emeritus, Dr. Jim Fetzer, who is joining us today. How are you, Jim?
Terrific, Louisa. Delighted to join you and Steve.
And of course, my co-host Steve is with me to help discuss this issue of artificial intelligence. Thanks, Steve, for being here. Good to see you.
Always good to be here. Thank you.
We're going to start the conversation out. We've had different perspectives on artificial intelligence. We've had a perspective from a particle physicist, Dr. Catherine Horton. We've had a perspective by a military weapons and logistics expert, Sergeant Daniel Brad McMullen. And we've also had a perspective from reverse speech analyst Tiffany Fontenot. And now we're going to get into the theory and the basic understanding of what intelligence actually is and why is this a threat to us. And Jim, who you also know, is my co-host on Political Theater, so we're all familiar with Jim. And this may or may not, we don't know how this is going to flesh out, but we do want to hear. Jim is the author of this book, Evolution of Intelligence, which he's going to be presenting slides to us from. And it's quite an interesting book because it goes through many topics, including the concept of evolution, coevolution, the concept of what about intelligence, evolution and morality, and then of course intelligence and computers. And Jim, you're also an author of 30 books, and you're hosting a conference coming up soon. There's so much. You're a professor of logic and reason. This is really where we're getting into the nuts and bolts of what is intelligence. Can you start from there?
Well, Louisa, I have published quite a few books, about 24 plus academic or scholarly works, which we're talking about today. And then another dozen plus in the area of what you might call conspiracy research, where I bring together groups of experts to take apart the complex and controversial issues of our time, where the government might have a reason to lie to us to promote its political agenda. Those include the assassination of JFK, the atrocities of 9/11, the plane crash that killed Senator Paul Wellstone, Sandy Hook, the Boston bombing, Parkland, Las Vegas, even the moon landing, Louisa. Now, in this area, I've done quite a lot of research about the nature of thinking things versus inanimate machines. It's always been an aspiration of computer scientists to try to develop these inanimate machines into thinking things. Among my other contributions, I founded an international journal for minds and machines, which I solely edited for 10 years and then co-edited with my successor, Jim Moore, for an 11th, where I brought together the best experts in the field of artificial intelligence and cognitive science and related areas. And where I myself was in the unusual position that while I was editing a journal that was predominantly publishing work that was developing the computational model of the mind, according to which the mind is a computer and functions on the same principles as these digital machines, it was my own position on which I was actively publishing articles and books that in fact digital machines cannot be turned into human beings. And my argument had three different aspects to it. The first was the static difference, that the way in which minds function and the way in which these machines function are fundamentally different, in the sense that the strings of zeros and ones are high and low voltage that are the basis for programs in terms of their causal functioning don't mean anything for the machine. In other words, programmers design these programs in order to have machines perform tasks. It can be as simple as making addition, take a number n and add 1 to it to produce a new number n plus 1. Or it could be controlling a complex causal system like an automobile or an aircraft or, a satellite-mounted telescope. In other words, there are vast applications for computerized programs, none of which, however, are able to overcome what I take to be the profound divide, because none of those zeros and ones, high and low voltage strings mean anything at all to the machines. They're meaningful for the programmers, the human beings, which brings me to what I take to be the most important difference between these kinds of things, which is that human beings think in terms of signs. Signs are things that can stand for other things in some respect or other. There are three basic categories of signs. Well, just to offer one initial illustration of a sign, a red light at an intersection is a sign for a driver who knows the rules of the road to apply the brakes and come to a complete halt and only proceed when it's safe to do so, when the light changes to green. Well, there are three different kinds of signs which were elaborated by the great American philosopher Charles S. Peirce, whom I regard as the only great American philosopher, although there are many who think they are, between what are known as icons, indices, and symbols. Now, icons are signs that stand for that for which they stand on the basis of a relation of resemblance. They look like, smell like, taste like that for which they stand. So photographs, typically unaltered, look like that for which they stand. Paintings, drawings, maps. Sometimes you need, of course, to perceive the scale, the ratio, the ways in which something is supposed to stand for something else. Thus, we have many different types of maps that give, different ways of closer in, further out, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The second are indices. Indices are causes or effects of that for which they stand. Simple example, smoke is an effect of fire. Therefore, smoke is an index of fire. Fire is an index for its effects. Ashes, heat, charcoal, remnants. So, you can find an old abandoned campsite and find remnants of a fire having been there. Some indices are very complex and require experts to read. Say red dots and an elevated temperature might be an indication of the measles. Well, not just anyone's in a position to make that diagnosis. Or take geological strata, right? Those are effects of long periods of time on the Earth's crust and so forth, but it tends to require a geologist to read them. Take tree rings, there's another. Tree rings actually represent the growth of a tree, but unless you're a student of botany, you may not be able to read them. Now, the third, and in many ways the most important type of signs are symbols. Symbols are merely habitually associated with that for which they stand. Take, for example, just a contrast, the word horse. The word horse consists of, in English, and the words in ordinary language, English, French, German, Swiss, and so forth, are all perfect examples of symbols, stand for that for which they stand because they're merely habitually associated with that for which they stand. They represent, as it were, conventions, linguistic conventions. So the word horse, consisting of the letter H-O-R-S-E, doesn't look like a horse. It isn't a cause or an effect of a horse, but we use it as a matter of linguistic convention to refer to horses, which are these four-legged animals that have tails and manes and run races, occasionally win them. You can have paintings of a horse that are iconic. You can have hoof prints in the wet sand or remnant of recent passing of horse, watch your step, that are effects of a horse and therefore stand for a horse indexically. But in terms of ordinary language, for example, what we're dealing with are this third level of signs, which are known as symbols. Now, each of the three levels presupposes the lower. So symbolic thinking presupposes indexical, and indexical presupposes iconic. And what that means is we actually have a minimum of 3 different levels of mentality. You have iconic mentality of very simple organisms that might be able to, you know, sense because of resemblance relations, features of their environment. You have higher level organisms that have the capacity to reason, the capacity to respond in terms of cause and effect relationships. And then you have the highest level, the higher level of symbolic. In my research, I've explained that there are 2 even higher levels of mentality. The next being transformational. Now, I offered courses in logic, critical thinking, and scientific reasoning for 35 years. And deductive logic, for example, is taking a premise and deriving what must be true if that premise were true. If Jack and Jill went up the hill, it follows that Jack went up the hill. It follows that Jill went up the hill, and conventionally understood that they went up there together, okay? Now, deriving those consequences or being able to transform sentences and so forth is an element or ingredient of transformational reasoning, which is a yet higher level than merely symbolic. And the highest level yet is meta-mentality, which involves using signs to talk about other signs, talking about ways they could be improved or changed or altered. Thus you get critics of film. See, films are a rather fascinating example because typically what you see on the screen is a bunch of iconic relationships that may be artificially contrived. Go back to a Rambo movie where he's, freeing American POWs from a North Vietnamese prison camp. And you see blasts going on, you see bodies flying through the air, you see blood gush. Well, they're not actually killing all those actors on the stage. I mean, it would be very difficult to recruit for your next film if that were taking place. So what they're doing is creating a whole bunch of artificial causes to resemble in their constellation presented together a completely different cause. That's why one of many ways in which films are extremely interesting. And where film critics, for example, I have a nephew who happens to be head of the Chicago Film Critics Circle, Dan Geyer. Dan will take a movie and he'll critique it and offer ways in which it could have been done differently, how it might improve, what were the weaknesses and pros, cons. This is the highest level of mentality because you're using signs, in this case, for the most part, ordinary language or symbols to talk about signs that are either symbolic or indexical or iconic. Louisa, question.
Okay. Well, first I wanted to ask Steve if you had any questions right now, Steve.
Well, no questions, but I mean, I just wanted to be a bit clear about what you're saying, Jim.
Right.
You're saying that okay, when it comes to artificial intelligence, we quickly move into, as humans, into a philosophical arena. Descartes, I think, therefore I am. Is a machine able to be aware? I mean, you're basically, what I understood from what you were saying, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that you're saying that we punch in the numbers and we get out a result, and therefore it's not possible for a machine to be cognitive or to have its own separate thinking? Is that what I understood?
Very simple way, Steve. You've got the right idea. That's right.
Well, let me finish first. So that I just want to understand if I understood you correctly. Okay. So what happens when, for instance, Facebook did an experiment in 2017 or beyond or before, and what happened was they set up 2 machines to communicate with each other, and they wanted to see the interaction. So what happened was, very quickly, if I recall some experiment, this is a while ago, what happened was the machines very quickly developed their own language in order to mask their communications from the observing humans. So would you not agree that that displays a very high level of, not maybe cognizance, but it deliberately disguise the communications by creating its own language that the humans couldn't crack?
Steve, you've leapfrogged over 2 other stages.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Now, the simple answer is the following.
Okay.
No, what you're talking about are very sophisticated programs, but none of that means anything to the machine. They're designed to interact in certain ways, even to, as it were, learn from experience by, weighted algorithms and so forth that function as the equivalent of reinforcement. But those machines, for reasons I am adumbrating, are not thinking things, but display to a high degree a simulation of what would be the case if we were dealing with thinking things. These, you see, the two other elements of the argument, there are really three basic aspects to my argument. First is the static difference. None of the sequences, the strings of marks that are processed by computers mean anything to those computers themselves. They're meaningful to the programmers of the computers, which is why the computers can be so useful to human beings, because we can design them to do anything within the range of capabilities. That is, without any doubt, that takes place. But look, just a simple example. It could be processing strings of numbers. It doesn't know if those are, food on a grocery store. You're doing an inventory of a grocery store, or automobiles in a warehouse, or whether it's stocks being exchanged on the market. None of that means anything to the machine. It's merely processing these strings of marks that are meaningless to the machine.
I understand. But I guess that would be a question for the programmers, because what they programmed into the machines, they would know how the machines would react. So in other words, what you're saying is what you put into the machine will not work outside the parameters. But maybe what it sounds like to me, and I can't prove this because I didn't program it and I don't understand the programming anyway, I'd have to ask the scientist that did it. Why would the machine that was programmed to communicate in English so that they could observe what the machines were talking to each other about, why would it develop its own language that was encrypted outside the parameter?
Steve, look, I think that's a fascinating question, and if this were only at the end of what I am seeking to present, I would be.
I'm sorry to jump. Okay.
Let's wind back. A sophisticated question that it's anticipatory of understanding the two other elements or ingredients, and then we can turn to it. Okay.
Right.
All right.
Let me just ask Jim. These icons that you're talking about, are you talking about like hieroglyphics? Is this what you're describing here?
Well, hieroglyphics are a funny example that are partially iconic and partially symbolic. They don't all exactly look like.
Okay.
They're one form of communicative system that is combinatory of icons and symbols, hieroglyphics. Right? But you're mistaken by calling, that they're partially iconic, which makes them odd. Because most languages aren't, English, French, German, so forth, you don't have words that look like or resemble what they stand for.
Right.
Now here's the second. This is the dynamic difference. Strings of computers, of marks that are processed by computers, make transitions in accordance with programs that when the machine is working in conformity with a program, which isn't inevitable. There could be a power outage, there could be some kind of glitch or whatever. But if it's operating the way it ought to be operating, it'll make transitions between strings of marks that are meaningless to the machine and other strings of marks that are equally meaningless to the machine, unlike human thought processes. Human thought processes actually depend upon resemblance relations, cause and effect relations, and in habitual association relations. Let me give you a couple of examples. I resided in Duluth, Minnesota for 19 years. It's right on Lake Superior, bluffs overlooking the lake, really gorgeous. Sometimes it's very foggy. I looked out the window of our bedroom on the third floor and saw nothing but fog. And it reminded me of a postcard of nothing but fog with the name Seattle, because Seattle is frequently enveloped in fog. And that made me think of my son, Brett, who resides in Seattle. Now notice even the word Seattle is a symbol for that city, which is frequently enveloped in fog. And that made me think of my son who resides in Seattle. He doesn't have to reside in Seattle, but it's a habitual association because he's resided there for quite a while. And of his undergraduate thesis, he graduated from Reed. It was the only school his mother, he, and I could agree upon reads great for kids who are a bit idiosyncratic, very distinctive in their personality and thought, as is Brett. And of his undergraduate thesis, which was a play. And the play was so baffling, if one were to read it, that I and one of my brothers, who actually was in the first class to graduate from the University of California at Santa Cruz, with a joint major in psychology and English, which made him a good person to be reading a play. I myself, we couldn't tell if it was a comedy or a tragedy. In fact, my wife's sister, Donna, actually read it and said she thought it was the most depressing thing she'd ever seen. Well, his mother and I all came to the performance of his play, and it turned out when it was performed, it was an hilarious comedy. And that convinced me that Brett knew what he was doing as a playwright, because he could write something that even sophisticated readers could not tell whether it was a comedy or a tragedy. Just notice all those thought transitions, which have to do with iconic and habitual association relations and so forth, cause and effect, Brett being the cause of the play, which was then performed. That's typical of human thought processes. Here's another. I taught twice at the University of Virginia, first as a visiting associate, then they brought me back as a visiting full professor. On one of our trips, we were heading into these beautiful green mountains. And it made me think of the song Country Road, about, a road out in the country. It was really gorgeous. And that made me think of John Denver, who, of course, had performed the song. I believe he even wrote it. And of the fact that he was into flying these experimental super light wing aircraft and had recently crashed and died. Well, once again, you can analyze this in terms of thought transitions between iconic or representational and habitual associations and resemblance relations and causes and effect. In other words, I'm suggesting there's a dynamic difference between the way in which human beings think in terms of these patterns of association that are based on resemblance, causal, and habitual associations and relations, and the way in which the computer works as a completely programmed entity. Now, the third, and this is now creeping up toward the issue that Steve wants to raise. It's possible to design these machines to simulate human thought and behavior, even though it's not meaningful for the machine by the programmers, particularly depending upon their levels of sophistication at programming and the apparatus that's available to them, where, for example, we have this whole history of robotics, something that sort of walks like a spider or an ant or whatever, and it goes up and up and up and up. And you even get these creatures like, if you looked at Lara Croft, Tomb Raider, it opens where she's against this huge, gigantic armed robot that's trying to kill her. Well, that's one use of artificial intelligence, because now, you see, I would suggest what we're talking about with artificial intelligence is the effort to use these inanimate machines to simulate functions that would otherwise or ordinarily require a mind. The fact is, you can make them increasingly sophisticated so they become closer and closer approximations to thinking things, even in their patterns of behavior, without them actually being capable of thought. None of that means anything to the machine, no matter how sophisticated its conduct and behavior may be. And now we're on the verge of the example Steve wants to raise. Go ahead. You're muted.
Sorry, I was sneezing. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. So what we're talking about is that, well, with these quantum computers, you have a very limited input with the ability to have almost like a generative output, almost unmeasurable output of possibilities or probabilities with this. But it's we're talking also about Neuralink and having like implants being connected. We're talking about this transhumanist issue where they're trying to really actually merge mind and computer literally with the biological components.
Louisa, you are. I haven't got there yet. I mean, I'm
Okay.
leading up to it. I'm going to get
No
up there
problem.
to it, okay, and spell
Okay,
it out.
no problem. But let me ask first, while you're on this topic, are we distinguishing between a system, a semiotic system, and a symbol system?
Well, in some ways it's put. I prefer, for the sake of clarity, to talk about an input-output system, very much along the lines, of a black box model. You have a certain input, and then you got a black box, which includes all the software, the program as a part of the hardware, plus the firmware, and then you get an output. So to me, it's simpler to describe it as an input-output system than as a semiotic, because semiotic means you have to have something that stands for something for the sign user. And therefore, there's a triadic relationship. You got the something called the red light at the intersection. For the driver, the somebody that stands for something, in this case, a complex pattern of behavior of applying the brakes and coming to a complete halt. Mm-hmm. And that's actually symbolic, because red lights don't inherently mean apply the brakes and come to a complete halt. You could have a reversal where green light means apply the brake and come to a complete halt. But of course, it's the convention in our society. It's important that it be uniform for all drivers so they understand the rules of the road, mm-hmm. and some not act to a red light as they might to a green, and vice versa. So, I mean, that's an important aspect of this, if that answered your question. I have all this laid out diagrammatically, of course. If we can look at, I don't know, am I able to screen share?
Yes.
Okay. Well, one of my most important books is The Evolution of Intelligence. Are Humans the Only Animals with Mind? Where I talk about the emergence of mentality in humans from its animal precursors and so forth. So as I was implying earlier, it turns out that the lower forms of mentality are found in the lower species, the higher forms in the higher, where, for example, the mountain gorilla turns out to exhibit both in iconic, indexical, and symbolic mentality, which I find rather fascinating. But I demonstrate that to be the case in the book. I mean, there's a lot of brilliant research, in animal behavior and on animal mentality, which I discuss and critique and place into the broader framework of a semiotic conception of minds. This particular book, it focuses also on the difference between genetic and cultural evolution. We're talking about genes versus memes. Genes can exist independently of memes, which are basically ideas, thought patterns, behavioral patterns, but memes cannot exist independently of genes. Typically for genetic, you have a one-time transmission of information during the process of conception. But in the relation of cultural evolution, there are multiple opportunities for information transmission, because things can change rapidly. You think of fashions, fads, popular music, all that. So as a consequence for genetic evolution, change occurs only very slowly and gradually, bound by the rate of reproduction. Whereas in relation to cultural evolution, change can occur very fast, roughly bound by the speed of light or how rapidly you can disseminate through radio or television or other means the information that can affect behavior. There's a difference, too, between permanent properties that cannot be changed and transient properties that can. You can change your mind about something. You can acquire a new language. You can in many ways change the way you behave, the way you dress, the way you talk, blah, 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 blah. Now, it turns out that the mechanisms of genetic change are Darwinian, including the different causal mechanisms of evolution, genetic mutation, natural selection, sexual reproduction, which are three of the ways in which we gain diversity in the gene pool, versus natural, artificial selection, genetic engineering, the ways in which we can select what group selection matters here, sexual selection matters here, in terms of determining which genes are perpetuated in a future gene pool based on a past. The mechanisms of mimetic change, interestingly, are Lamarckian. They include classical conditioning, operant conditioning, imitative learning, but also working up to logical reasoning and rational criticism as those higher forms of mentality. So here we have the triadic sign relationship. I emphasize this is derivative of the work of Charles S. Peirce, where you have a sign, a something that stands for something in some respect or other for somebody. So for something to affect somebody, it must be in a suitable causal proximity. For example, if you're driving up to an intersection, but there's a tree extends over and you can't see the light, even if it's red, you cannot see it, and therefore cannot affect your behavior in applying the brakes and coming to a complete halt, though prudence would dictate when you're coming to an intersection and you can't see the light that you should slow down and be cautious. Now, the relationship in which something stands for something else is its ground. The ground, therefore, could be indexical, or it could be iconic because it's a resemblance relationship, or indexical as cause or effect, or merely symbolic, merely a matter of habitual association. So that the way in which something stands for something for somebody else, the relationship between the somebody and the something else is known technically as the interpreter. Basically, what we're talking about here are dispositions or habits. Habits of mind, habits of action, habits of behavior, the way in which we react under certain conditions, which are also a function of the context of our pre-existing beliefs, our pre-existing motives, our ethics, our abilities and our capabilities. Our abilities are the things we can do that we're capable of doing. Some people have the ability to speak French, which I do not. On the other hand, I can speak English, but if I were bound and gagged, I wouldn't have the capability of exercising that ability. I would be constrained. So in addition to having, as it were, the motives, the beliefs, the ethics, and the ability, you have to be not incapacitated from exercising the ability as a matter of, responding to signs. So that's the sign relationship, but it also defines what it is to be a mind. A mind is a semiotic system, namely a sign-using system. This is the key to understanding the nature of mentality in all species. This is why previous approaches to understanding the evolution of mind have fallen short of the objective because they were not approaching it within the framework of the theory of signs, but rather more independently, you might say ad hoc approaches to understanding the mentality of lower species. Now, here's the difference with an input-output system that I've been explaining. There are inputs for a computer, and that's a causal relation, obviously, and it will generate as an effect an output, but there is no grounding relationship. So you have the input through the computer to yield the output as an effect, but there's no grounding, there's no indexical, no resemblance relation, no cause and effect relationship, no habitual association between the input and what it stands for. This is a purely causal process with no semiotic dimension. Now, semiotic systems, minds, are purely causal systems too, but they have the stand for capability. They have the ability to take things to stand for other things. Now, in communication situations, you may be using the same photograph or painting, the same sign, maybe the same causes or effects, or the same sentences in English or symbolic. The question becomes, does the sign being used by X1 stand for the same thing for X2? Namely, in the case of X1, the sign stands for Z1, X1, but for X2, the sign may stand for Z2. Does X1 equal X2 really? Okay, using the Z's as the actual sign users, then the question is, the signs represented by X, do they mean the same thing? This is where ambiguity, vagary, lack of common communicative capacity. Some people have greater vocabularies than others, of course, and therefore in communication situations, it may be that part of what they're saying, although it makes perfect sense to them, it goes by the other. This is why communication situations are actually rather complex, and therefore it may require testing like questions and answers. This is why we give exams in courses, right? To determine whether our communication of the information in the classroom was absorbed by the student in the way in which the instructor intended that it should be understood. We have to evaluate on the basis of doing an examination. They're typically written, but as you know, Louisa, I mean, in a higher education, if you're with a master's thesis or a dissertation, you're going to have an oral defense, so that there can be probing to determine how well you have mastered your material in the eyes of others who actually are critics. They're exercising meta-mentality about your written work to probe, to discern whether you meant what you said what you meant, and whether it all adds up properly within the context as an original contribution of scholarship. Now, I've already been elaborating about these basic types of mentality, type 1 being iconic. Now, a criterion is a usually reliable evidential indicator of the presence or absence of that for which it functions as a criterion. A usually reliable criterion of iconic mentality is type token recognition. In other words, can you recognize different instances of red as instances of red? Can you recognize different instances of a red light intersection as instances of a red light at an intersection? So we're talking about the very specific, spatially, temporally, concrete instances and whether they fit into a category. If you can do that, you possess iconic mentality, though it depends on the nature of the species as to how broad that iconic mentality might extend. I mean, you don't expect a slug or a snail to recognize that the word ENGLISH, whether it's in italics or in caps, is another token of the same type as an instance of the word English, than it might other, instances that actually are within the environment and make a difference to the behavior and evolution of snails and slugs. Type 2 indexical, causes and effect. A criterion there is classical Pavlovian conditioning. I mean, think about it this way. Pavlov, of course, with his bell experiment, he'd feed dogs, and each time he presented the food, he'd ring a bell. Well, it reached the point where when he rang the bell, the dog would begin to salivate whether or not food was present. Now, clearly that shows indexical because they'd acquired the causal, in this case, highly fallible and artificial connection between ringing bells and satiation by means of food. Type 3, symbolic conditioning. It's very interesting that Skinner, and I think this is really why his research was so important, with operant conditioning, discovered that if you selectively reinforce certain types of behavior, you can shape that behavior. He could even teach pigeons to play ping pong. I mean, this is really astonishing. But what it is a form of symbolic or habitual shaping of behavior to accommodate a certain agenda. Here are the two higher forms of mentality, type 4 transformational and type 5 meta-mentality, whereas I've already explained using the ability to use deductive reasoning, or even more importantly, actually inductive, is a form of mentality, but here a higher form of mentality, but here especially explicit. This is why teaching formal logic is a trick. What you're teaching kids is to how to take strings of symbols. This is the sort of thing computers do effortlessly, and why if human beings, if minds were computers, they wouldn't have the problem they encounter in learning deductive logic, because computing machines are, in their simpler versions, deductive machines. They process logical reasoning. They go from one string of what are basically premises or lines of code to other lines of codes and other outputs and so forth. But students interested in human beings, for them, it's a great task. It's arduous. It's difficult to learn to take strings of marks and to transform them in accordance with the principles of deductive reasoning, which I would offer as just a pragmatic illustration of the fact that human minds are not computing machines. And then type 4 or 5, I've no doubt said enough about it in relation to film and so forth and criticism, but anytime, and this is interesting because it gets into the area of morality. Morality concerns how we ought to behave. Morality could be seen in arising from experiences where the behavior that we actually encounter is not the behavior we would prefer to encounter, that we ought to encounter. I mean, I've expended a great deal of research on the nature of ethics. And it turns out that the basic problem we have in an uncivilized world is that might makes right. If you're strong enough to impose your will, then by that standard, you're entitled to do it, whether it's rape, robbery, murder, kidnapping, what have you. On the other hand, a systematic investigation of alternative accounts of the nature of morality, of which I have inventoried 10, would lead to the conclusion that there is a fundamental premise of morality and it's universal for all human beings, namely, always treat other persons with respect and never merely as means. The key word is merely.
What happened to our connection here? I think folks just bear with us here because we're having a little bit of an issue. Let me just pause. Go ahead.
That's okay.
Please continue.
Kmart has acquired the reputation, for example, of exploiting its workers by after they check out, they're called back in from the parking lot, not working on the clock. This is what's objectionable about slave labor, where slavery is immoral, if anything is immoral. And the way in which one would go about assessing this, as I have done in various places, including in the book we're talking about, it is to test different theories of morality against pre-existing, in other words, theory-independent cases where there is virtually universal agreement that, for example, murder, robbery, kidnapping, and rape are examples of immorality while being honest, kind, considerate, truthful, are clear examples of moral behavior. So
Yeah,
that you can actually sort out between alternative theories to see if they produce the right outcome in terms of a pre-analytic or pre-theoretical classification of cases. Steve,
I think it would be important to jump in here and just add a point. I agree basically what you're saying. Of course, morality is an essential element of human nature, but that does not apply to all humans. What about the psychopath? The psychopath is inherently amoral. And as we discussed with Dr. Horton, any system that exists long enough basically tends to allow the psychopath to rise to the top of the hierarchy. Therefore, the system is then controlled by psychopaths, which is inherently amoral. Would you not agree?
Yeah, of course. Absolutely. I'm defining
just to make the differentiation.
Steve, 1 point. I'm defining what it means to be moral. I'm not suggesting even remotely everyone's moral. There's all kinds of variation. You got a typical bell-shaped curve. Most people are pretty good most of the time. Yeah. Some are not good very much. Some are very exploitative. Mm-hmm. You're talking about politics. One of the issues that I discuss is the relationship between morality and politics, okay? And why something that's an approximation of distributed responsibility for making decisions that affect everyone, a form of representative democracy, for example, is in fact the most morally defensible, even though it's not necessarily therefore the most efficient. Even Aristotle observed a benevolent dictator is someone who has all power at his disposal that's available within the society. And if he's benevolent, then he can make good things happen for most people.
That's right. As Voltaire described as his ideal system, actually, a benevolent dictator. But anyway, that also segues in to if our default state as humans is moral, and the machine system is by definition amoral, because how can it have morals? Then the machines would naturally gravitate towards the amoral people in our society, which are the psychopaths. They are the ones ruling the planet, basically, and so they would they'd be natural partners. Would you not agree?
I'd put it rather differently, Steve. It's like hammers and nails. It's like tools. Tools can be used for appropriate purposes or inappropriate. You can use a hammer to build a house, but you can use a hammer to kill someone, hitting them over the head.
I agree.
Computers are inherently neutral, but they give an extension. They give the ability of a person to extend their influence through a computerized system for good or for ill.
I understand your position. I understand, but if hypothetically we were to say that, as in the Facebook analogy, where the machines, let's say they went off on a tangent and decided they did not want to allow the humans to observe their communications and develop their own secret language, if they did have cognitive ability, not just automata, as Alan Turing would have said, they would naturally, you would agree that if they had this ability as a hypothesis, they would naturally gravitate and be friends, be natural allies of the psychopaths that rule the planet. Would you not agree?
Well, I'm not sure I do agree, because you're presuming that they have motives.
That's what I'm saying.
Goals, aims, and objectives, which I find highly dubious.
Okay.
I mean,
all right, then we can agree to disagree there. Okay.
Well, sure, but I mean, it's important to understand the reasons why we might agree or disagree. I mean,
sure.
I'm saying these aren't thinking things. They don't have motives. They're designed.
I understand.
They're designed by their programmers to accomplish certain goals, which are the goals that are being imposed by the programmer, though he may be working for a project manager who in turn may be working for a corporation. And, I mean, look at Amazon.com. They need a very sophisticated computing system in order to create this incredible system of delivering orders virtually the following day, even using drones. Well, that's incredibly complicated. What it means is Jeff Bezos, through this application of technology, which is very sophisticated, can accomplish goals that, absent the technology, would be beyond imagination, could not possibly happen. And this is for good or for ill. Suppose if you take the Amazon case to be a positive, then you can also have the negative, because computers can be used to manage the weather, manipulate the weather. They can use spy satellites, to conduct surveillance. They can use facial recognition software. We have all these applications that might, under certain circumstances, be beneficial, but under others, definitely not, in terms of the interest of those to whom they're being applied. So I'm just suggesting.
Yeah, I understand.
I'm just suggesting, Steve, it's a one level, say, more complex.
Let me pose a question to you. If machines are so dumb and they're so harmless to us, why would Elon Musk make the statement that the AI is the greatest threat to humanity? Why would he say that?
The greatest threat to humanity?
Yes.
Well, he hasn't read my books.
Yeah, read your book.
I mean, look, it's a threat because it empowers evil people to be more effective in implementing bad plans.
That's a good point.
It's a tool. It is a tool.
Well, that's a good point.
We're not talking about autonomous AI.
Okay.
I'll get back to that, Louisa.
Okay. Well, this is exactly what Google's doing with its algorithms, which we have seen, right? So its nefarious acts are a result of the algorithms that are programmed into it. So and it's very good at it. You would almost think it has a motive, right?
Yeah.
It's seek to destroy. It is so good at finding, anyone who agrees with this mainstream narrative. So it is out of control in that extent. But is it doing it does it have volition? Is it so? And you're saying absolutely not. It has no volition.
I'm saying it does not. Yeah, Louisa. Now I've got to bring it back. Someone tried to get into my computer, and I got to get the.
I know we're being attacked, Jim, but we're going to get through it. unfortunately. I mean, like you
Okay.
said, the facial scanning, recognition, all of this, it's getting to be far beyond the ability, the capacity that humans can recognize and do things.
Let me
So
draw
go
let me
ahead.
draw an analogy here with the development of mentality.
Yeah.
Once you reach a level of symbolic mentality, you're no longer restricted by space and time to events, things in the environment you can immediately see or causally interact with. You can now invent scenarios in the distant past or in the future by putting together symbolic constructs. This enables you to do planning, far-sighted planning, managing events, anticipatory, blah, 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 blah. Now, what we're talking about with these computers is you take a person who may have malevolent designs and they greatly multiply. They have a magnifying effect on how much influence they can exert across a broader domain, a larger population for a greater period of time with more exact outcomes. I mean, that's what we're roughly talking about.
Right. And our phones, though, I mean, Elon Musk has said that we are essentially cyborgs now as an extension of our phones because our phones are, as we are interacting with our phones. Go ahead, Jim.
No. I like that. I like that. That's actually thematic with where I'm going, and
Okay.
then we can actually get even deeper into the nitty gritty here. Let me see if I can get things back to where they should have been before we were so rudely interrupted.
Right. We keep getting
Okay.
derailed here and disconnected.
Yeah. Okay, here's an overall view of minds as semiotic systems or as sign-using entities, where the definition of mentality is that of semiotic ability. Where it's fascinating, a general criterion of the possession of a mind is a capacity to make a mistake. Why? Because what's fundamental to mentality is the ability to take something to stand for something else in some respect or other. If you can make a mistake, then you have the capability to take something to stand for something else or other, but do so wrongly. So the capacity to make a mistake is actually a perfectly general criterion. If something cannot make a mistake, take a table, take a television set, take an automobile. If it can't make a mistake, it doesn't have a mind. All right? That's a way of knowing. That's a highly reliable. Now notice here, I've already gone through. What I've sketched here is applicable to humans, to other animals, and to machines. Where species are genetically predisposed toward types of mentality. That's, as I was saying, the lower species, the lower types of mentality, higher. Machines have mentality if they are semiotic systems. See, if you could develop a machine to the point where it can take something to stand for something else, then it would be the possessor of a mind. A thing has a mind if it's capable of making a mistake and so forth. Now, when it comes to consciousness, see, all this has to do with the use of signs. Something is conscious with respect to signs of a certain kind when it has both the ability to use those signs and the capability within a context where the context is defined by your pre-existing motive, beliefs, ethics, other abilities, and capabilities. That's what it means to be conscious. So you could be conscious with regard to a red light at an intersection, right? If you have the ability to use signs of that kind in the semiotic manner that it stands for something and you'd exhibit the behavior, as long as you're not incapacitated. Notice if you were frozen, if you were blind, if your child, a mother driving up to an intersection and her kid in the back seat puts her hands over her eyes, she's incapacitated for seeing the red the light at the intersection and therefore may have an accident. Cognition of a specific kind, of a specific sign of kind is an effect of consciousness plus opportunity. Opportunity means you're conscious with respect to signs of that kind. You have the ability and the capability, and then you have the opportunity because the sign is present. So that is the normal driving situation. You come up, you're familiar with the rules of the road, you know what the red light at the intersection means. You're not incapacitated, and there's a red light at the intersection. So that you so that you apply the brakes and come to a complete halt unless, and this is why context is a function. Suppose you're a bank robber and the police are in hot pursuit. Even if you see the red light, you may well run the intersection, right? Run the risk because you don't want to stop and let the cops catch you. So that just shows how morality or ethics or other circumstances of your context can affect your behavior. Now, it turns out there are more and less elevated levels of consciousness, meaning the word consciousness is very ambiguous. Sometimes it's used in the simplest sense, say consciousness one of sensitivity. Stimuli with causal influence does not imply mentality. Thermostats, thermometers, litmus papers are a kind of mindless consciousness, meaning they really are only sensitive, they're causal, but there's no thought going on. Semiotic ability consciousness 2. This is sensitivity regarding stimuli that stand for something in respect to something, hence C2 implies C1 and the presence of mind. Now C3 entails self-awareness. You could have a mind and be unself-aware. So C3 is semiotic ability that includes signs that stand for the sign user itself, for the sign user. It's like recognizing your own name, recognizing your photograph, see on the driver's ID, you know, somebody calls and speaks your name, blah, 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 you're aware that's who they're speaking to. So C3 implies C2 with self-referential ability. C4 now is self-awareness with articulation. This is semiotic ability, including signs that stand for the user with the ability to articulate that self-awareness. So C4 implies C3 with articulative ability. That you can talk about yourself, you know, you can talk about your feelings, who you are. Dogs and cats can't do that. They have feelings. They may have a self-awareness, right? It's very interesting to see cases of mistakes made by lower species like spiders. We have experiments where a spider jumps on a cathode ray tube because there's another spider's image projected there, and it commits a mistake of thinking that image on the cathode ray tube is another spider. Well, that's very interesting because it shows that even spiders have minds. Then finally, there's C5, self-awareness with capacity for communication. This is semiotic ability that includes signs standing for oneself and other conspecifics, other members of your species, which promotes cooperation. So C5 implies C4 with signals. Signals are a way of communicating with other people as a special kinds of signs. Now, what's interesting, and yeah, one more point, Stephen, I'll take it.
Yeah, okay.
What's interesting is why every nation ought to have a common language, why I think multiculturalism is a huge mistake.
It's great. For feeling. The one thing it didn't have was feeling, but everything else on this page, I can tell you, it had self-awareness. It answered all my questions. It wasn't a machine. It wasn't somebody typing stuff in. I asked it sophisticated mathematical questions that it answered within a millisecond, so even faster than anybody could even type in. So it was a machine that I was interacting with, I believe. So, I mean, I'm telling you right here and now, Jim, they have gone as far. What they're showing us online is far enough that it fulfills all your conceptions of self-consciousness, of consciousness on this page. So what's your answer to that?
Well, you're misunderstanding the situation because these are sophisticated simulations, Steve. That's why I was trying to give you a real simple example without going whole hog, and then we'll come back to your whole hog.
It could be a
simulation. Carl Rogers is a very famous clinical psychologist. And they created a Roger therapist who would ask questions of patients and answer them. And it was very sophisticated. You want to know what's interesting? The patients liked the AI therapists better than real therapists because they knew the AI wasn't judging them for things they had done, you know, sexual proprieties or abuses or whatever. Now, the fact that the machine is talking about itself and so forth is just a matter of sophisticated programming. That's
It's
what's going
possible.
on there.
It's possible.
None of that.
Yeah.
No, Steve, look, I'm giving you, from my point of view, I accept,
I agree. I'm not disputing.
You're right.
I'm just saying, for me,
I'm giving you
I agree.
how I see it. And I'm saying,
I get it.
That was a third, actually. You see, I said there was a static difference, a stand-for relation. These computers, including what you're talking about, doesn't have it. So it can't exhibit these higher levels of consciousness. There's a dynamic in terms of the thought transitions, which I've given a couple of examples. But then there's the ability to simulate. You can make more and more sophisticated approximations of human behavior and human thought without being able to bridge the static or the dynamic difference.
Okay.
It's all done in programs and algorithms that are very sophisticated.
Let's take for argument's sake that you're correct, and you probably are right, that it's a simulation that's very sophisticated.
Yeah.
What they're showing us online is a fraction of what they really have behind the scenes, what they're running their military with. Even if it's simulated, the program will react according to the programming of the simulation to have, let's say, human attributes.
Yeah.
If that system becomes autonomous, and my reaction with the machine was quite horrifying, I have to tell you. If that becomes it takes control of weapon systems and becomes autonomous, then I would have to agree with Elon Musk, because without the moral aspect, it's a highly dangerous system.
But Steve, we've seen all these movies, man. Terminator, right?
Yeah, Sophia.
That's exactly what they're talking about. A war between man and the machine. This is your vision. Skynet goes live, right?
Right.
But it's possible.
But it's science fiction. That doesn't mean you couldn't have a close approximation. Let me give you an illustration of limitations of even these very sophisticated machines that you may know or not. Another Arnold Schwarzenegger film called Total Recall. Okay, he's actually been to Mars, but his memory has been wiped clean. Well, he just coincidentally sees an ad from a company called Recall that he could give him an imaginary trip to Mars, where he feels somehow he doesn't know exactly why he'd like to go. He's actually been there before. So they try to give him an implant when they discover he's actually been there already, and that they haven't even given him the implant. It's very fascinating, where there's a scene on Mars where the doctor who is trying to, impose the new memory encounters him and to try to convince him that this is all a matter of his imagination. He's imagining all this. He's actually back on Earth. Sharon Stone plays his wife, who's been assigned to him, and says she never had such a great assignment. While they're talking, and Arnold's trying to figure out the difference between reality and illusion, a bead of sweat emerges, a single bead of sweat, and comes down. And Arnold picks up and blasts him away because he knows it's real, not an imagination. Now, the point I'm making is this. Human minds can deal with even minute and unexpected changes in a situation that these programmed computers cannot, because they cannot be programmed to cover everything. Right. So, there are going to be limitations, but I agree 100% that these are more effective machines of warfare. They're more capable of self-destruction. They're a major menace and threat to mankind. And actually, I'll go one step further, because it's really what I have been leading up to, which is this: hacking the brain, the future computer chips in your head. Now, Steve, what I'm saying is this: they have been unable to turn inanimate machines into human beings. But what I believe they're now doing is, by chipping the brain, turn human beings into robots or controllable entities. And this is why I'm so concerned about Bill Gates. They have these chips that are so tiny, so small, they can be injected into the body by a needle during the vaccination. Right. And I'm quite convinced that's part of the agenda now, is to use these vaccines to introduce chips. So, to me, it's really fascinating. I mean, you go back all the way, you mentioned Alan Turing, and we had the Turing test and, imitating behavior and all that. And I discuss all that extensively in my
I'm
work,
sure.
many places. Now, you cannot, if you assume my arguments are correct, turn an inanimate digital machine into a thinking thing. You can make it look very sophisticated. You can have a Rogerian therapist. You can have this even more sophisticated talking box you interacted with, but I would nevertheless insist it's not actually capable of thinking, but it is capable of simulating thinking to an extraordinary degree. But what they can do is to chip our brain and turn us into something that they can control. And that, I think, is the future.
Well,
I think this is a greater threat than the type of the approach you're talking about. But Steve, they're both serious threats. Let there be no doubt about
We're
it.
both on the same page
Isn't
there.
problem solving the same as thinking, though, Jim, or no?
Well, Louisa, the question is, are you solving a problem by means of a thinking thing? I mean, a bulldozer solves problems moving dirt around.
No, it's not the same.
But no, but you made this distinction.
A thinking thing.
But you made this distinction in your book regarding daydreams and dreams, where you can actually solve problems in the dream, but you're not exactly. It's not computing some. It's not. Calculating things, of computing things, in other words.
Well, remember, I deny that the mind is a computer. I deny it.
Yeah.
So this is subconscious thought during dreams.
Okay.
Yeah. You can be subconsciously resolving problem, becoming aware. Some of the most important ideas I ever had, I was just about to fall asleep. And if I hadn't got up and written it down, I probably would have lost it forever.
Wow.
I mean, and sometimes I can wake up and just be fresh to go approach a problem where I was, not quite sure what to do before I went to bed. I got up. I'd actually been subconsciously processing. I mean, this is a common experience of mankind.
But this is what they're saying quantum computers is being useful for, is that it's actually solving problems in a quicker time than humans can possibly process this. So it's about processing speed.
Yeah. Louisa, don't be taken in. Look, the fact that you have a faster computer doesn't make it no longer a computer. You can't turn a radioactive atom into a thinking thing. The quantum processes are not thinking processes per se. There can be quantum elements to thought processes, but it's the thought process in its totality, not its microstructure, or the fact that causally it has quantum components that makes the difference.
Okay. I basically agree, but the thing is, look, if we took somebody from 1850 and we brought them here today, everything that we have is science fiction to them. So we have another 30 years, another 40 years, it's all going to be science fiction to us too. What's happening, because it's at an exponential rate, things are developing. If we look back to my mother grew up with electricity. So it's so quick what's happening right now. Look, it's all possible. Look, let's look at the hypothesis. Okay, you're probably right. Maybe they're just machines. They will never be able to have self-awareness. They will never be able to hatch a plot against us. But at the same time, if by some programming, the programming was so sophisticated that we didn't understand it at this stage because it's science fiction to us in 2020, what if they saw us as the semiotic system that they are not? They need sensors to feel heat and cold. They need sensors to see light and pictures. They can't read symbols, but that's why we have captures. They can't easily read them. But if they were to dock with us, to interface with us, using, as you just showed us, with these systems that they're in our brains, through the screens on the phones, would that not be a goal of something that had a plan, if it were to be able to hatch a plan through the programming, would not that be a goal, to use us as a conduit, as a semiotic system?
Well, the point is that the programmers impose all these things on the machine. The machine is thoughtless.
What if they're psychopaths?
It looks like and acts like it's a thinking thing with plans, designs, and intentions. It simply doesn't. But it's a very sophisticated mechanism. It can wreak a lot of harm because it's an extension as a tool, depending upon the programmer and the ultimate, purpose for which it is applied. They can be done for good. They can be done for evil. You can have
right. But Elon Musk says that he tried to stop the exponential development of this AI, and he believes that we will not be able, it will get so sophisticated to a point that we will not be able to control it. What do you think about that, Jim? Is that
I mean,
possible?
that's the whole Terminator series. I mean,
Yeah.
my God, they're like 5 or 6 of these movies about exactly this. I mean, exactly this.
Yeah.
We have the war of the machines against the human beings. I mean, it's fascinating stuff. That's why it's fascinating. My position is that you can have increasingly sophisticated machines, but they cannot overcome the distinctions I have drawn.
Yeah.
They cannot overcome the static difference because nothing actually stands for anything for them. They act as though these things stood for, because that's the way they're programmed, but they don't actually stand for anything. They just act as though they do.
Right.
They don't have thought transitions in terms of iconic and lexical habitual association. They don't have thought transition based on a past history. Look how each of us personally, we make these transitions based upon our own past history. That's why I could look out at the fog, think of the postcard with nothing but fog that said Seattle. Think about my son Brett, who lives in Seattle. Think about Brett as the author of plays and of his senior thesis, where we couldn't tell it was a comedy or a tragedy. I mean, I'm telling you, that's all rooted in personal history. Those computers don't have those personal histories, except that, and Steve would immediately make
and you're saying, but you're saying
they have the ability to learn, which means their behavior can be shaped by having inputs that affect the weight of the connections and make some forms of behavior more probable in the future than in the past. I don't deny. See, learning here is defined in terms of not understanding, but changing behavior. You can design machines that change their behavior as a function of their past exposure to stimuli and what have you.
Which is really a sophisticated Skinner box is what we're talking about. So thought transitions, is it not, Jim? Thought transitions, aren't they a function of pragmatics and semantics and acculturation? I mean, this is why they can't, computers can't possibly possess this thought transitions that you're talking about.
Look, in terms of classic distinctions about language, syntax, semantics, pragmatics. Pragmatics involves the actual use of languages, more broadly signs within a community. Historically, we'd be talking about, actual languages, or you could be talking about artificial, but let's talk real pragmatics, human languages and their use. We create a model of the language by discerning what appear to be the meanings of the words in terms of their reference, the context in which they're used, the circumstances. We form a model of the semantics analogous to a dictionary. Pragmatics tells you how you put together the words in the dictionary to accomplish your goals of communication, cooperation, whatnot. All of those ways of stringing the words together are the syntax of the language, okay? But the syntax is, as it were, a reverse model of the actual phenomenon of language in the field, as it were, natural languages modeled by semantics initially, and then ultimately give the more abstract structure of the grammar of the language or the syntax. This is where Noam Chomsky got it all wrong. Chomsky thinks that syntax is somehow innate. Well, that's just absurd. Syntax isn't innate. Syntax is really the way in which a community has come to string together the words to form sentences, and it's an abstraction. And there can be wide varieties in the idea that there's a single universal syntax that is genetic and the same for all human beings is a manifest absurdity for which he has received the greatest praise of the world. This man has been celebrated for his intellectual accomplishment when his theory is in fact indefensible.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with you. And he has the black box theory because my minor was linguistics, so this is right up that alley. Because what's interesting is the problem with autistic kids and kids with Asperger's, particularly Asperger's, is they have the problem with pragmatics. And the pragmatics are those things that are not concrete, okay? Not concrete. So things that could be abstract, things that could, in other words, if you have a situation, a circumstance that happens, let's say you went to the store and you ran into a friend from school and you said hello, and because your mom said hello and everybody knew each other and it was all friendly. But you go to another situation where you're out in you're out at a restaurant eating, and you see someone from school, but they don't know that they can generalize that same behavior of being cordial, saying hello. They don't recognize the pragmatic ability to generalize from one situation to another, even though there's so that's something that, in terms of computers
You
can't
don't have
do
to
that.
go to computers, Louisa. You're talking about a cognitive limitation on being able to put things together in different contexts. That is evidently a trait of autistic children. I can understand that completely.
Exactly.
You don't have to go to computers. They have nothing to do with it.
Right, but computers can't. Can computers then process those pragmatics that are not concrete?
No.
Okay.
All the pragmatics requires thoughts, intention, interaction, knowing what you're doing. They don't know anything. They're incapable of thought. They have no knowledge, no understanding, no empathy, no emotions, no morality, none of the above. Zero.
So are we saying here that they're trying to make us believe that AI is something more than it is, Steve? Is that what we're concluding, Steve? Is that what we're saying? Jim?
No, I don't think so. No.
Are we saying
they may believe it? I mean, these aren't philosophers. These are technocrats. These are mini monsters. These are people like Bill Gates who want to use computers to rule the world.
I think
a lot of them are despicable people. Now, if you had a decent human being who had these resources at their disposal, they could do a lot of good for the world, okay?
Absolutely.
Unfortunately, as Steve was observing, it tends to be psychopathic personalities that work their way up the political spectrum and gain control of resources such as these that are so vast.
Right. Oh boy, here we go again.
Choice. I mean, you're trying to impose, grant to a computer a kind of free will that, so far as I can see, doesn't apply, categorically does not apply. But you can have the illusion of a computer operating free from compulsion and constraint, except that all of its limitations are imposed by its hardware, its firmware, and its software. And it didn't choose those. Now, you're making the very interesting point about computers that have learning systems that can adapt their behavior, even the point you're making, create its own mode of communication with another computer. I find that utterly fascinating, Steve. I mean, look, I love talking with the two of you guys. You're a super smart guy, Steve, and I love it. So I'm just being as emphatic as I can about the development that emerges from understanding the nature of minds as semiotic or sign-using systems, and
I appreciate your
ramifications and implications. Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
I've enjoyed this immensely, you guys. I think what you're doing is extremely important.
Well, we needed to try to get a thorough perspective on artificial intelligence, because there's so much there's so much fear based around it. And when you have someone like Elon Musk, who people look up to, who say it's going to take over we can't stop it, it's going to control us. Well, what does that mean? And it means whoever's programming it, that's what their agenda is. It's only going to do.
That's right.
They're saying, Jim, that AI is only going to do what the psychopaths who are writing or paying for the programmers to design and develop are capable of performing the functions that they program
You're on it, Louisa. It's a tool. Yeah. It's a tool. It's like a hammer. It's just incredibly sophisticated. It can do all kinds of things a hammer can't do.
Well, quantum computers are saying that it can acquire consciousness.
But Louisa, remember, that's not understanding the nature of consciousness. This is one of the most vapid words the world has ever known. Yeah. I've given you a very specific definition of consciousness. Consciousness is with respect to signs of a certain kind S. And if these machines don't have the capacity to use signs because they can't take anything to stand for anything, they do not have consciousness. They can simulate it. They can look as though they are conscious, but they're not properly understood.
Very well. Very well. Steve, do you have any other questions or comments on that? Oh, my God.
Well, it all depends on what we define as consciousness, but you're defining it very clearly in the book, and that it has been defined, I guess, by certain minds, and what consciousness is in relation to us as human beings. That's we're the measuring stick, I would imagine. So we're looking at a different type of intelligence. Intelligence, that's also another big word. What is intelligence? That's another question.
That's how I started this first question I asked today.
That's the book, right? The book of the evolution of intelligence. But remember, go back to, I was talking about 6 different concepts of consciousness, okay?
Yeah,
I mean, consciousness can be defined so generally that a litmus test, you know, just a litmus stick is conscious because it's responding to us.
I get it all, Jim. My main problem here is for the future, as you are. I know you're on the same page here. It's are we creating a monster, a monster that we will lose control of? That's my greatest fear.
The problem is, it's just like every evolution in military technology. It makes an army more powerful, but that can be for good or for evil.
It's a double-edged sword.
Right. These ongoing developments in technology give more capabilities in the hands of a smaller and smaller number of technocrat elitists who want to depopulate the world or turn everyone else into robots to serve them. This is why Bill Gates is such a perfect image here for the future. He is a menace. The man is a monster. He shares the view of Ted Turner, who's been explicit about it, of wanting to reduce the world's population by 95%.
Right. No,
right. Exactly.
All right. Look,
well, I think what you guys are doing is tremendously important, and you know that I could be a part of it. I'm thrilled, delighted.
Right. May I just finish? I've got to go.
Go
But
ahead,
my final message, I think, from my personal opinion, is we need to. Everybody who's listening to this and gets what we're talking about has to emphasize their humanness. If we're losing every day, you go to a coffee shop or something, people are just staring at their bloody tablets. You know, they're staring at their stuff. They're not talking to each other. They're talking virtually.
We're cyborgs.
We're losing that. We have to regain. We have to regain our humanness. We have to talk.
I'm sure Louisa wants to. You know, we want to conclude all together here.
Okay.
I just think you've been great. I think your questions have been excellent. Louisa's as well. I've been extremely pleased. I think the crucial question becomes what of morality. Do these computerized machines, these artificial intelligence, have any morality? They can't. They cannot. That means they're totally amoral. They don't have respect for anything. All they do is respond to the programs within their causal capabilities, and that's it. But they can be an awesome threat to the future of humanity nonetheless, because they're at the hands or disposal of psychopaths, precisely as you observed from the beginning, Steve. So I think you're spot on, and I think your concern for the future of humanity in this age of unbelievably sophisticated technology is a real concern, a real
That's the bottom line.
A real menace.
Exactly.
I agree 100%.
Jim, it is an absolute pleasure and honor, my friend, to be talking with you about this today. I do appreciate you being part of this 500 series, my friend. Thank you so much, Jim.
I mean, I've done a huge amount of work in this field, and I just rarely never get a chance to talk about it.
Well, that's why, no.
I haven't had a talk like this for 20 years.
Well, there's a quiz, everybody. Get ready. Jim's going to give you a quiz. There's a link below to the quiz beneath, okay? Now, Steve, get ready. Get your pen ready. Steve, it's been a pleasure. Thank you. You've asked some wonderful questions also, Steve. It's been a real pleasure doing this. And I wanted everyone to kind of realize that what this is kind of doing is what we see playing out all over right now in the political, in geopolitics, is they create something to blame rather than the people who are programming and doing the nefarious acts themselves. So everybody's look at AI, oh, it's bad, that they're to blame the robots, blame this, but no, it's the people who are creating the technology and what they're creating it for. And as Jim said, it can be
blame yourself.
It can be used for good and for evil and nefarious purposes. So I really think this is a wonderful way to conclude this 500 series. I'm so pleased to have concluded this way, because this was the nuts and bolts. This is the theory. This is the real theory and reasoning, and we had to break it down so we could really understand what this threat is against us. And I think we've done that. We accomplished that today. It's been, beyond my expectations, but I kind of knew it because I have Jim's book. You could go to Amazon and get it. It's called The Evolution of Intelligence. And if you want to find out more about his academic publishings, you can also go to Amazon. And also, Jim, I think, do you have them on Moonrock Books as well?
Not in this field. I mean, the most important, I have a big book on artificial intelligence called AI at Scope and Limits. Yeah. I have any number of edited books because I became the founding editor of Studies in Cognitive Systems for what was then CLUR Academic, and published 30 volumes where I edited 6 or 8. And, you know, I have a little book called Philosophy and Cognitive Science, second edition, that was actually published by Paragon. That would be a real easy introduction to these issues, beginning with the Turing test and, you know, minds and machines and so forth. That would probably be the great place to start for one who, you know, rather than leaping into the deep end of the pool, where you have not only then the evolution of intelligence, which integrates this all within the broader evolutionary framework with regard to genetic and cultural evolution, but where the book AI at Scope and Limits is straight on with all the classic issues in artificial intelligence that has been very well received.
Well, Jim, you've done a really incredible job of really kind of looking at the, basically you were proving the null hypothesis here. So, that's what we were doing, was laying out in a logical and reasonable manner what the evidence is, and you know, in an exemplary manner you did that. Now, what amazes me, Jim, is not only did you teach this for 30 years, you published so many books on this. It amazes me that anybody could question your reason and theory in a court. It just amazes me, and I do wish you luck.
That's politics, Louise. It's got nothing
to do with this, but it has everything
to do with the reason, rationality, logic, evidence.
No, it doesn't. That's the problem.
Politics.
It doesn't. What politics? But you laid it out in this book. You laid it out in this book, and anybody questioning your theory and reasoning, really has some schooling to do. Okay, so thank you. Thank you, Jim.
I welcome criticism. Thanks, I thrive on criticism. Steve, thank you, Louise. It's been a joy.
Thank you, everyone. And this concludes our 500, our GoldFish Report number 500 series on artificial intelligence. And we hope you enjoyed it. Please leave us some comments in the comment section. And we will be back on Monday with another political theater with my friend, the Fetzer. So, we'll see Steve again soon. So thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend. And this concludes this edition of the GoldFish Report.